Hi there, today I'm going to show you how you can achieve nested looping within Zapier using webhooks. I've made a previous video on the topic of nested looping with Zapier. However, in this YouTube video and this flow diagram, I show you how you can use an external system like Google Scripts to do the nested looping. And this external system packages up your data into packages of 500 rows. And we use 500 rows because Zapier is limited to iterating through 500 rows at a time. So this external system packages up your data into rows of 500 and then uses a webhook to send these packages of 500 to Zapier, where Zapier then iterates through those 500 rows. So in this video, I show you how you can use an external system to do the nested looping. However, in this video today, what I'm going to show you guys is if your external system cannot do the nested looping for you, then we can use webhooks in Zapier to do the nested looping. In this case, our external system, all it does is send a webhook to Zapier to let Zapier know, hey, I want you to start iterating over all the data that is available. Then within the Zapier, Zapier has access to the data it needs. And once it knows it needs to start, it then goes through 500 iterations, a maximum of 500 iterations. And then if there are still more iterations to do, meaning there are more than 500 rows in our database, if this is true, then we are going to send a webhook to the very top here, and we are going to increase the index. So the first time we receive the webhook from our external system, we will be starting from 0. Then the second time, when we restart the nested looping process, we will start from row 501. Then we'll iterate through another 500 rows. Are there more iterations? If yes, then we're going to send another webhook to restart the whole looping process. And now we'll start from row 1001. And then we repeat this process until there are no more iterations left. Then we do not send this final webhook and our Zap finishes. Okay, before showing you what the Zapier workflow looks like for the right-hand side of this diagram, I just want to say that if you want to know how to do looping in Zapier using webhooks without nested looping adding extra complexity, then take a look at the Marketo program cloning via API post. And although this goes through an example using Marketo, the principle and the logic that I go through that demonstrate looping in Zapier with webhooks will give you a good foundation for the rest of this video, because as I mentioned at the start, this goes through using webhooks for looping in Zapier without the complexity of nested looping. So this is a great introduction for you, and I highly recommend you check out this post. Okay, so now let's check out how this right-hand side of the flow diagram is set up within Zapier. As I mentioned before, all your external system does is send a webhook to Zapier to let it know that it needs to start iterating. And this external webhook will send a starting index of 0. And then it sends the starting index of 0 to a catch hook trigger in Zapier. And then Zapier has access to the database that we want to iterate through. So in this case, it is a Google Sheet. And then what this Python code does here, and I'll go through it in more depth later on in this video, this Python code packages up the data in our Google Sheet into rows of 500. So the very first time we come into our outer loop here, this Python code is going to take the first 500 rows in this sheet and then send them to this create loop from text action to loop through those 500 rows. Then, since there are more rows to go through, we're going to come back to the top here. And now our Python code is going to get the next 500 rows. So it's going to get rows from 500 to 1000, send these to Zapier to iterate through. Then if there are more rows to iterate through, then the third time we come in to our Python code, then it's going to get rows 1000 to 1500. and send those to Zapier. Send those to this Zapier action for iterating. Okay, so now let's take a look at what this create loop from text action is doing. We can see that it's sending an email for every email address in each row that it gets. And then the job of this filter here is best explained by looking at the flow diagram. So this filter blocks the Zapier workflow from progressing to send this webhook until this inner loop or this nested loop has gone through all of its iterations. So once this inner loop has gone through all of its iterations, then if there are more iterations to do, then let's send a webhook to restart the process. Or if we finished all of this internal looping and there are no more iterations, then our Zap finishes. So I'll show you what this filter looks like a bit later on, but the overarching goal is let's let this inner loop complete all its iterations and stop the inner loop from progressing to this post hook step until the inner loop has finished all its iterations. Once the inner loop has finished all its iterations, we then check to see, is the outer loop finished? If the outer loop is finished, then this filter stops the Zap from progressing and the entire workflow stops. However, if the outer loop is not finished, then it progresses to step 7 and then the whole looping process starts once again. Okay, so now let's take a look at how we can use a Google script as our external system to send a webhook to Zapier. I've given you the GitHub code repository link, so you can copy and paste all of this code into your own Google script. So you can copy all of this, then in your worksheet, you can go to extensions, go to app script. You can click on the plus icon here to create a new script, and then you can copy and paste in all the code that you got from GitHub. I already have all the code here, so I'll walk you through how it is set up. And this is quite technical and in-depth, so you can skip ahead to the end of this video if you want to see how the Zapier workflow is set up. But if you are interested in using a Google script to trigger your Zapier workflow to start its nested looping, then I'd recommend taking a look at how all of this code is set up so that if you need to modify it for your own use case, then you can. So the very first thing we do in this sheet is we get a reference to the customer database large sheet and we store it in this variable. Then using this variable, we get all the values that are within this sheet and we store it in the rows variable. And then we define 4 new variables, the name string, order string, emails, and phone string. And then we are going to use a for loop to cycle through each row in this Google Sheet one by one. And in the case that the delivery today column is equal to true, so when using JavaScript, the indexes start counting from 0. So what I mean by that is this is index 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So here we are accessing the 4th index in row number I. So the 4th index is the delivery today column. And when this is equal to true, we'll come in to this section of the for loop. So therefore, the overarching goal of this for loop is to only populate these 4 strings when the delivery today column is true. If you don't want this extra bit of logic in your code, you can just delete this part here and the corresponding curly bracket here. So you can see if I mouse over this curly bracket, this other one here lights up. So you can just delete this and delete this. And now when your for loop runs, it will pull in every single row in this sheet, no matter what the value of the delivery today column is. However, if you do want the delivery today column logic in there, then just leave this in. Now, to show you what this inner part of the for loop is doing, I'll show you what the output of these desired for strings is. So I'm going to run the script here. And we can see the value of the four strings, the name string, the order string, the email string, and the phone string. We can see each of the output values that we want. And this is what this inner part of the for loop achieves. So in the case that the delivery today column is equal to true, we want to take this value, add it to the name string, take this value, add it to the order string, take this value, add it to the email string, and take this value and add it to the phone string. And then we want to repeat this for each row where the delivery today column is equal to true. So our for loop will go through every row in this sheet, make this evaluation to see if delivery today is true. And if it is true, let's add each of these four values to their four respective strings. So we can see that the first time we come in to this section here, we check to see if the name string is equal to nothing, basically. That just means it's empty. If you put the two inverted commas with nothing in between, you're just asking, is the name string empty? If the name string is empty, let's just store the name in the name string, order in the order string, email in the email string, and phone in the phone string. However, the second time we come in here, the name string will not be empty. It will have a value already in it, like Tyron1. So then we want to take whatever value is already in the name string, add the asterisk character, and then let's add the new value. Let's add the new name to the name string, like Tyron3 here. And then we'll come into this section again. There's already a value in the name string, so we don't come in here. We go to the else statement here, and then we'll take whatever is in name string already, which will be Tyron1 asterisk Tyron3. Let's add another asterisk, and then let's add the new name, which will be Tyron6. And then we repeat this for all four of the strings each time the delivery today column is equal to true. And then the output after this for loop runs is these four variables where we have all the names, order numbers, emails, and phone numbers for anyone with a delivery today, all joined together with the asterisk character. So then replacing these four print statements with our original code. So the first thing we are going to do now is we are going to get a reference to the concatenated column sheet, which is this sheet over here. And this is the sheet that Zapier will use later on to access the data it needs to iterate over. And then in this sheet, we use the getLastRow function to get the last populated row in this sheet. And then we add 1 to get the next empty row or the first available empty row. So the getLastRow function will get row 17 here, and then we add 1 to get the first available empty row. And then this code here just gets the current timestamp and stores it in the timestamp variable. And we'll use that later on in Zapier when we are looking up which row we're interested in. We use the timestamp. We send the timestamp to Zapier, and then Zapier searches this column for the timestamp that we have sent it from Google Scripts, and then it finds the row we're interested in, so it knows it needs to access the data from the row with the timestamp that we sent to it. And then here we are getting references to the 5 columns within the first available empty row that we defined up here. So we're getting references to each of these 5 cells. So that's what this line here is doing. It's getting a reference to each of those 5 cells and giving them a name and storing them in these variables. Then what these 5 lines of code do is it takes the references we set up to these cells up here, and it uses these references and sets the values in these cells equal to the timestamp string, the name string, the order string, the email string, and the phone string. So then that's what the output looks like. We put the timestamp value in here, we put the name string, order string, email string, and phone strings in here, and this is what it looks like. And then the final part of this is we send a webhook to Zapier to let it know, hey, we've got the data ready for you in this concatenated column sheet. It's ready for you to start iterating over. And then we send it the timestamp so it knows, using that timestamp, which row it needs to access the data from. And then we send it the number of rows it needs to iterate over. The number of rows it needs to iterate over is calculated from this rows value here. So remember, this rows value contains all the rows in our customer database large sheet. So in this case, our customer database large sheet has 1,251 rows. So therefore rows.length, which we use down here, will be 1,251. So we are letting Zapier know, okay, this is the total number of rows we need you to iterate over. And this value here of 1,250, that corresponds to the length of each one of these string variables. So within each of these strings, we will have 1,250 values joined together using the asterisk character. And then it's Zapier's job to break this into batches of 500 and then iterate over these 1,250 rows in those batches of 500. So it'll be first batch 500, second batch 500, and then third batch 250. And then we send it the starting index of 0 so that it knows it has to start from 0. So the first time it goes through, it will iterate over rows 0 to 500. Then the next time, when we restart using the post hook action from Zapier, it will iterate over rows 500 to 1000. Then the third time, it will iterate over rows 1000 to 1250. Okay, so now let's take a look at how the Zap is set up. So we received the webhook from the Google script, and we can see that the starting index is set equal to 0. We get the length of the number of rows we need to iterate through, which is 1,251, and we also get the timestamp. And then in the next step here, the lookup spreadsheet row action, we pull in the name of the Google Sheet we're interested in, we pull in the worksheet, then the lookup column we're looking up is the timestamp column, and we're looking up the timestamp we received from the webhook. So what this looks like in the Google Sheet is we are going to search for this timestamp in the timestamp column here. So that would find this row and pull in all 5 of these columns. So we can see that in Zapier. If we test the action, we can see it's pulling in the timestamp column and then the other 4 columns which contain all the values we need to iterate over. And then, as I mentioned before, this Python code step is responsible for taking the 1,251 values across our 4 different names, orders, emails, and phones variables and breaking them into batches of 500 so we can then iterate over these batches of 500 in our for loop. So in this action here, we can see we specify all the names, orders, phones, and emails we pulled in from step number 2 here. We pull in the starting index from the webhook. The limit is 500, and that's Zapier's iteration limit. And then we pull in the length, that is the number of rows we got from the webhook. If you want to copy this Python code, I've included it here in the blog post. In this section here, you can go to this link and copy all the code here from GitHub, or you can just copy it straight from the blog post directly. So the start of this is just converting each of these three variables from the string format that we received them in into integer format so that we can do comparisons like greater than or equal to. You can't do this with strings, but we need them to be able to be integers so that we can do this kind of comparison. And then here we're doing a check to see, is the start index plus the limit, which is 500, greater than or equal to the length or the number of rows we have to iterate over? Because if this is the case, that means that in this next batch, we are going to finish all the rows that were sent to us via the webhook. So in this case, we are setting the end index equal to the total number of rows that were sent to us from the webhook. So in this case, it would be 1251. And then we are going to mark the finished value as true because we use this finished value in this filter to decide whether we need to send another webhook to restart the nested looping. Else, if the start index plus limit is less than the number of rows that the webhook sent us, then end index is going to be equal to the starting index plus the limit. So we're just going to add another 500 on, and we set finished equal to false. So the very first time we come into this Python code, the starting index is 0. So we add 500. So therefore, we're not greater than or equal to length. That means we are going to come in here, and the end index will be 500. Then the second time we come in, the starting index will be 500. We add 500, so that's 1,000. We're still not greater than or equal to length. We come in here, the end index for the second time through the zap will be 1,000. Then the third time we come in, start index plus the limit will be 1,500, and this is greater than or equal to the number of rows that were sent to us in the webhook. So therefore, the end index will just be the length, which is 1,251. And then this final part of the code here just splits these four variables from the starting index to the end index. So the first time we come in, it's going to take from 0 to 500 and store it in names. The second time we come into the zap, it's going to take from 500 to 1,000. And the third time we come into the zap, it's going to take from 1,000 to 1,251. So that's how this Python code slices each of the input variables we get here into batches of 500, or batches of a maximum size of 500, because as we'll see, it's 500, 500, 250 in this example. And I'll show you what the output looks like. So we can see we get all the names here from Tyron 1 all the way down to Tyron 500. And we have the exact same for the orders, emails, and phones. And then the final part of this is we just pull it into the create loop from text variable. We pull in all these names, orders, and emails, and then we specify the delimiter, which in this case is the asterisk character. And we go from 1 to 500. And then we include these variables within the email. So we can substitute in the email, the order number, the name, and again, the order number in the body here. The filter setup now. So we can see that the filter will only allow the zap to progress to step number 7 here when the nested loop is on its last iteration and the finished value is equal to false. So you'll remember here that in step 3, if there are more iterations for us to go through, then we set finished equal to false. So therefore, the very first time we come into the Zapier workflow, the nested loop is finished. Finished is equal to false. So therefore, the Zap progresses to step number 7 here. We pull in the timestamp and the length that we got from the first webhook. And then you can see that we are setting the starting index equal to 500 here because we've already done the first 500 rows from the Google Sheet. So now the next time we come into the Zapier workflow, we want to start from row 501 and go to 1000. So we set the starting index equal to end index here. And then let's test this out. We go retest action. And then we go to the top of our Zap. And we see that the starting index is now set equal to 500. We look up the same spreadsheet row in the Google Sheet. Now in our Python code, our starting index is now equal to 500. So therefore, start index, which is 500, plus the limit, which is 500. 1000 is still not greater than or equal to length. So that means we are going to come down here. Our end index is equal to 1000 and finished is still equal to false. And then when we are slicing these 4 values we get from Google Sheets, we are slicing from 500 to 1000. And then when we rerun this code, we'll see it go from Tyron 1 to Tyron 500 to Tyron 1000. So then this latest batch of 500 is passed to our create loop from text. And if we rerun this, we'll see that all these values will update. And then they'll be populated in all the email sends. And then again, this filter will only allow the Zap to progress once this nested loop has reached its last iteration. And there are still more rows to go through. So then again, it would be true. We'd come in here. We can now see that the starting index we are going to send to restart the nested looping is now equal to 1000. So let's go continue, retest the action. And then if we go to the top of the Zap again, we'll pull in this latest request. And we can see that the starting index this time is 1000. So we'll look up all the values again. Then in this code step, we'll notice that the starting index is now 1000. So this is going to be 1000 plus 500. This is greater than or equal to the number of rows we have, which is 1251. So in this case, the end index is going to be 1251. So we are going to split all 4 of these variables from 1000 to 1251. So then we are going to take these batches of 250 rows. We are going to send them to our create loop from text. Let's rerun this Python code actually. I forgot to do that. So let's go test. You'll see we're going from Tyron 501 here to 1000. So when I update this, it'll go from Tyron 1000 to Tyron 1251. And then we are going to pull this into our create loop from text. We can see all these values have updated to the 1001 to 1250. Then these will all be populated inside the email when the for loop runs. And then this time, we can see our Zap would not have continued. And the reason for this is because this loop iteration is last, is set to true. However, this finished value that we get from the Python code, if we search for finished here, is now equal to true. And the reason for this, as I mentioned before, is we came into this conditional statement here. We set end index equal to length, and we set finished equal to true because there are no more rows for us to iterate over. So therefore, in this filter, the first part of the filter is true because the nested loop has finished all its iterations. However, finished is now equal to true, so this second part evaluates to false, and the zap does not progress to step 7, and the entire workflow comes to an end. And there you have it. That's how we can achieve nested looping within Zapier using webhooks. And in my next video, I'll show you guys how you can iterate through a Google Sheet and update all the rows in a Google Sheet using this action. So stay tuned if you want to check out that video. It's a very similar setup to what we've done so far. However, it is slightly different since we are updating the Google Sheet as opposed to retrieving information from the Google Sheet. And I've got some follow-up stuff here you guys can take a look at as well. If you want to figure out how you can do the nested looping part within Zapier, within a code by Zapier action, then take a look at this blog post here, where I outline how we can achieve this. So instead of having a looping by Zapier action here as the nested loop, we've actually got a Python loop, or it could be a JavaScript loop. It's just a code by Zapier action. So take a look at that if you're interested there, because that has the advantage that it is no longer limited to 500 iterations, but it is limited to a 10-second timeout, as I mentioned at the top of the blog post here. I mentioned that here. And there's some other posts I share down the bottom that you can take a look at. If you want to see how to best import data into Zapier from Google Sheets, depending on the amount of data you have, check out this post. And if you want a refresher on how to loop in Zapier, you can check out this Zapier for each loop quick start guide. I hope you found this video useful. If you did, please give it a like. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. And if you want to see more content like this in the future, please subscribe.